right, Mr. Guyot, good evening. And would you, for the benefit of our audience, would you identify yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Lawrence Guyot. I was born in Pasquistan, Mississippi. I became involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I attended Tougaloo College, where I became acquainted with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I attended Tougaloo College because it was a college threatened with destruction. It believed in integration. It practiced integration. Campbell College had been destroyed. I won a scholarship to go to Tougaloo.
How did you win that scholarship?
It was an academic scholarship.
Academic scholarship.
Uh-huh.
From high school?
From high school. There was a competition. Mm-hmm. Dean Branch came down, gave it. I won it. And then I discovered that if I played football, I wouldn't have to pay anything at all. Mm-hmm. So for the first time in my life, I played football and played very well. And got on the team and did quite well.
Now, how were you introduced really to the movement and the struggle?
The movement to me came to my hometown. I mean, I was born in Pasquistan, Mississippi, where there was no Klan activity, where there was very little racism, where the Catholic Church desegregated its Catholic elementary schools and made it clear that anyone who interfered with that would be excommunicated. The racial policy on voting in my hometown was my father and I registered anybody black we wanted to. When whites ran for office, they came into the black community and campaigned for our votes. And what I now understand why that was the situation. We're talking in Harrison County. At that time, we were talking about a population of 119,000 people. 100,000 whites, 19,000 blacks. You had a heavy Catholic influence. You had a heavy labor union influence. Ingalls Shipyard, right in Pascagoula, was hiring people from 56 counties to produce all of the war implements from the Second World War. Any time we've gone to war, Ingalls has made money. So what you had was an atmosphere. I mean, I could use the public library. I was a longshoreman at the age of 12. I used the white restroom simply because of one simple fact. My father would have killed anyone who interfered with me. And everyone understood that.
So how can you, what is your most vivid remembrance, the earliest age you can, that you can recall of racism, the expressions of racism that were closest to you on the Gulf Coast?
My grandfather told me that he was feeding some white people. Feeding them. They had no other way to be fed if he didn't feed them. And one of them, after eating a meal given to him by grandfather, told him, he said, you know, Jules, the Republicans make black Republicans postmasters. And he said, you know, the thing that makes me most angry at all is for a black man to hand a white woman a piece of mail. And my grandfather telling me that drove home how powerful racism was, even in this non-confrontational setting. Mm-hmm. His brother was chairman, Louis Pianas, was chairman of the Republican Party in Hancock County, which adjoins Harrison County, for 50 years.
He said it would be the Black and Tan?
He was even before the Black and Tans, but then he was part of the Black and Tans. I was lucky enough to see a genealogy study I read an interview of him done by W.P. My Uncle Louis Pianas died at 105 years old. Mm. He was chairman of the Republican Party in Hancock County for 50 years. His mother brought an original piece of that land. My grandfather, Jules Pianas, was the Democrat. He would pull us together and have us listen to our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He would make sure that everybody was registered to vote. I knew early on that the Chicago Defender was delivered to our house by the postman, by the people who worked on the railroad. And we discussed everything else with white people except the Chicago Defender. That was our business. It was treated as such.
Now, you came to Jackson to go to school at Tougaloo.
What happened?
What did you discover as far as the student movement was concerned?
Well, what I discovered was that at Tougaloo I met a son of Walter Hayes.
Oh, well,
I met people from...
tell us who Walters was.
Walter Hayes
Folks don't know.
is one of the true heroes of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. A farmer in Holmes County. He and Hartman Turnbow drove over to Greenwood because we had the movement going in Greenwood before we moved into Holmes County. They watched everything we did. They watched the mass meetings. They watched how we passed out material. They watched how the speeches were given. They watched what happened when we took people to register to vote. They watched when we gave our clothes. They were the best monitors we've ever had. So they were prepared when we moved into that county. Now, Ralphus Hayes was a man who was one of my favorites. Ralphus Hayes was involved with the Children's Defense, involved with the CDDM movement. He was involved with
CDGM?
CDGM.
Don't know what that is.
The Children's Defense.
Child Development Group of Mississippi.
Child Development Group of Mississippi. He was also a key member of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He ran for Congress. He was a leader's leader. He was a man who could really listen to everyone, relate to everyone, and he was a builder. He was a man who is one of my favorite heroes in the Mississippi movement.
Now, what did he have to do with you getting into Tougaloo? And
Well, I simply, at the time I met him, he came to visit his son, and his son was a good basketball player, and I liked that. Okay, and that was the sum of our relationship. I met him in 1957, but then later on, I meet him again in 1963 when we began to organize. 62.
Oh, you didn't tell us what year you came to Tougaloo.
I came to Tougaloo in 1957.
57.
Right.
Okay.
And I, because of my involvement in the civil rights movement, I didn't graduate from Tougaloo until 1964. And incidentally, when I was graduated in 1964, I was in jail, and Lois Chaffee accepted my diploma from me. Now, Lois Chaffee was one of the delegates to the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, as was Ed King, who was the chaplain at Tougaloo, and he also was the national committee man for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So Tougaloo, to me, was an exciting intellectual oasis in the desert of racial apartheid and oppression called Mississippi.
What was the first movement activity that you can remember being involved in?
Well, I remember reading at Tougaloo that, first of all, I met everyone on the faculty, and they had a very impressive faculty as it relates to civil rights. A.A. Branch was a leader of the YMCA movement. A.A. Branch was the dean of Tougaloo College. His position was, Tougaloo was one of two colleges in the South that supported student activism. Miles College in Alabama was the only one. Any college that says it was is lying, other than those two. But Dean Branch told us, said, we're going to support you going to demonstrations, but take your books with you. We're going to test you just like everyone else. I met Martin Luther King in 1957 in Woodsworth Chapel at Tougaloo College. Brought there by Aaron Henry, and he was brought there with one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life. And she pretended to be Mrs. King. And we went right through that process until after a while, friendly, Aaron Henry said, wait a minute, the Sovereignty Commission is too well organized to state this is not Mrs. King. On the stage of Woodward Chapel,
No, he didn't do that.
I'm telling you, that is what I saw. And it then began to get me to understand the difference between the personal lives of leaders and their political lives. And I began to really appreciate the sensitivity and the support of the black community for black leaders who were flawless in their politics, but not so flawless in their personal lives. And they were always judged by their political performance and by their involvement with the empowerment and support of the community and not their personal predilections.
Did you get involved in the Jackson movement
I got involved.
at the earliest,
I got involved in
61?
First of all, I became a part of the NACP chapter at Tougaloo.
Oh, okay.
I met a guy named Bob Moses. He was introduced to me by Dory Ladner. Dory Ladner was from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Joyce Ladner, Dory Ladner, and myself were Tougalooans. We also were involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We also were involved in the Jackson movement. Now, the Jackson movement at that time was led by a Methodist minister at Howard University, and it was a quiet boycott. We were not to identify ourselves. We passed out material, but it was always very stated, very moderately drawn. But that later developed into a more serious endeavor, because what we found was that the people who were arrested in the sit-ins were coming back for trial. And I'm talking now about 62. Those of us in the movement in SNCC were at 714 Rose Street. That was the Freedom House. That's where we lived. One day, Charlie Cobb came to town. He was on his way to a conference on nonviolence in Texas. And I said, Charlie, you don't need to go to Texas. You stay here in Mississippi, and I'll teach you all you need to know about nonviolence. He stayed for 5 years, and he became part of the legend of Mississippi. And he tells this story today, and I tell it because it's true. What we're talking about here is a series of interrelationships of people who were committed. Charles McLaurin, one of my favorite people. Charles McLaurin lived in the Freedom House with us. LaVon Brown, Jesse Harris, Dory Ladner, Joyce Ladner, Dave Dennis, Bob Moses, Charles McLaurin, Curtis Watkins, Hollis Watkins, Curtis Hayes, a young man named Talbot from Macomb. That's where we lived until we decided to move into the Delta, and we moved into Amsey Moore's house on 714 Chisholm Street, and he spread us out into the Delta. He put us in.
Now you are acquainted with how the Jackson movement began.
Well,
What's the first activity you remember?
The first activity I
That sort
remember.
of ignited.
The first activity I remember was the boycott headed by Reverend Jones. Okay, and then we had the sit-ins. Well, we had the sit-ins with the understanding that as soon as they got into Jackson, they were arrested. A lot of young people were involved in that, and McLaurin says that a lot of the young people he was involved with understood that they wouldn't live very long, because they understood that they were not going to take the kind of oppression from white people that they had experienced. But they ran into a guy named James Bevel, who started talking to them about nonviolence. And then they were brought into SNCC. And I don't know of anybody who has been a more effective political organizer than Charles McLaurin. Charles McLaurin. I'm just so proud of him. Charles McLaurin went to jail while we had 714 Rose with others, and some of them would get up and wake up and be expected to be released every day. Not McLaurin. I saw Charles McLaurin later on write his own reapportionment plan and defend it before 3 racist judges. So Charles McLaurin was clearly the leader of the Sunflower Movement. And now there's a book that just came out, Let the People Decide, that accurately portrays his heroic and very positive role in that movement.
Okay. Now, your inspirations while at Tougaloo?
My inspirations at Tougaloo were all over the place.
Okay, that's good.
I met John Salter, who taught me everything I ever needed to know about socialism. I met Ed King, who was the chaplain at Tougaloo. I met A.D. Beidel, who was committed to making sure that Tougaloo was the...
Now, Salter was on the faculty.
Salter was on the faculty.
Ed King was...
Ed King was on the faculty and the chaplain.
And Beidel was on the...
Beidel was the president. A.A. Branch was the dean, and A.A. Branch was clearly a leader of leaders.
Okay.
A.A. Branch not only led in the YMCA movement, not only led at Tougaloo, he's the man who said to us, we will bring speakers from all ideological perspectives to Tougaloo. They're all welcome here, and you will listen to them. You will not shout them down, regardless of what they have to say. Dean Branch also said very clearly that we support the right of student activism, but we will test you like anyone else. You go to jail, but take your books with you. He was the man. I never will forget. I was sitting in the COFO office in 1964 when he walked in with the papers that began the challenge to WLBT's license.
This was who now?
A.A. Branch.
There you go.
He worked with the National Council of Churches, Aaron Henry, and others. And as you know, the first black television station in America was WLBT because of that successful challenge. The WLBT was a racist in 1962 when Reverend R.L.T. Smith ran for Congress.
Were you involved in that campaign?
I was involved in that campaign. Bob Moore was, Bob Moses was his quiet campaign manager, right?
Oh, Bob was? Okay.
We attempted to buy time at WLBT, and they told us they couldn't possibly sell it to us because the station would be bombed. That was part of the reason it was attacked. WLBT refused to show positive black film when it was shown. An address by a noted black lawyer, they had technical difficulties while that was going on. Their position was a firm policy of racism, and they lost that station. Aaron Henry, Ken Dean, and others took control of WLBT, and we were quite glad. But Dean A.A. Branch was part of that movement.
Now, what came out of the Jackson movement? The Woolworth sit-in, the Ivory sit-in, those were all direct action activities that were involved in the Jackson
What came out of that movement, John Salter has written, I think, one of the best books about Jackson. And I think that pretty much talks about the need of the national leadership of the NAACP to control events and to control people who they had any ability to influence. Medgar Evers was committed to working with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Ruby Hurley told him, you can't work for us and work for them. Because the policy was, how can the NAACP get as much credit for civil rights activity and not be involved in facilitating the opposition? This became very extreme, and Ed King and others can tell you about how Medgar Evers, 3 weeks before he was killed, was with us in Greenwood, Mississippi, and he saw a packed church of people in Greenwood talking about the fight for the right to vote, and he told us he would be working with us in the future. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Now, Medgar Evers was moving to break away, to really lead a movement and develop an indigenous people's movement in Jackson, Mississippi, but he had to fight through the leadership of the national leadership of the NAACP. They did everything they could to curtail him. They wanted to contain him. I think they were about ready to fire him before he was killed. They didn't quite come to that. But so what we see coming out of the Jackson movement is a real attempt to build a people's movement that would be issue-oriented, that would be controlled by people, and that was stymied by the national leadership of the NAACP. What we also see is that the movement, the sit-ins here, brought a lot of people to Mississippi, and they were arrested as soon as they were hit the steps. That was the policy of worked out by the state of Mississippi and the federal government. They were then sent to Parchman, but they were tried in Jackson. And the Freedom House at 714 Rose was a point of entry for all of those people tried. So
Who defended them?
Oh, they were defended by R.H.S. Brown. They were defended by quite a few people from various civil rights organizations.
Carsey Hall, Jack Young.
Carsey Hall, Jack Young. The Corps had quite a few lawyers involved in that. William Kunstler defended some of them. Kenoy defended some of them. Yeah.
All right, the Jackson move. And would you say that the aims and objectives were reached as you understood the aims and objectives to really open up Jackson, Mississippi and make it a habitable for all races? Was that ever achieved through that movement's activities?
No.
And what?
I think that what it had to deal with was a leadership in Jackson, Mississippi that was predominantly based in the church and in the labor unions and in the NAACP, all of which could be controlled. And it was a leadership from the top down. So it did not allow competing voices or people who were committed to organizing an institution that could be one of resistance. It certainly facilitated and assisted organizations of protest, but not of really of building power. I think that
And bringing about change.
And bringing about fundamental change. I think there were certainly some successes in the civil rights movement in Jackson. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals took the position that Jackson, Mississippi had an ironclad policy of apartheid, and they took that position early, and they stuck with it. We know that in 1964 and 1965, when we had demonstrations in Jackson in opposition to a meeting of the state legislature to change the voting laws after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we got 1,200 people in jail. I called for them throughout the state. They all came, and we were arrested, put in the
Now, the federal government was witness to all of this.
The federal government was witness to this. The federal government was...
And their response to the brutality.
They attempted to prevent us from having the demonstrations.
Right.
Because their position was there was no way that the state of Mississippi could alter the implementation of the 65 Voting Rights Act in Mississippi. We were not convinced of that at that time. So I called for the demonstrations. 1,200 people showed up. Al Bronstein later arranged for us, after we spent a couple of months in prison, in a couple of months. No, I don't know if it was months. A couple of weeks in jail in Jackson to pay the bond. We were all released on $200 bond. Now that goes back to something else. In 1962, 68 of us were arrested in Greenwood, Mississippi, and in Itabena, Mississippi, and we spent 2 months in Parchman prison. And the only way we got out of that, and our crime, Mr. Brooks, was registering black people to vote in the Delta. The only reason we got out of that was the National Council of Churches paid our Robert Spike, became a new director of the
Commission on Religion and Race.
Commission on Religion and Race, visited Mississippi, visited Aaron Henry, and Aaron Henry said, we got 68 people in Parchman, do what you can to get them out. Robert Spike put up the money to do that. Now, interestingly enough, in 1963, I invited the National Council of Churches and all major religions to come to Hattiesburg, Mississippi for a Freedom Day. Every organized religion in the world sent a representative to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I mean that seriously.
Hey.
Everyone. That was, Robert Spike opposed that because he felt that the new Paul Johnson, the new governor, was a Methodist and had given some moderate used some moderate language in his inauguration speech. So he wanted to give him a chance to do right on the question of race. So Robert Spike opposed the ministers coming to Hattiesburg. Not only did he oppose the ministers coming to Hattiesburg, but he changed his mind, because
Now, was this after Medgar's death?
this was yes, after Medgar's death.
After Medgar's death.
Because
And this was after the
You see-
killings that
you see, I remember Medgar's death very well, because Fannie Lou Hamer, June Johnson, myself were in jail in Winona when Medgar Evers was killed. That was June 13, 1962.
Okay.
So the Hattiesburg happened after that. Now,
That's where it happened. And it was also after they used the fairgrounds to jail the people in Jackson.
now that was 1965.
That was 63. It was done with the Jackson movement first, wasn't it? And then it was done later with the big statewide.
It may very well have been. I just can't say that with certainty.
Okay.
And I'm not sure whether Medgar was killed in 62 or 63.
63.
63. So I know it was June 11th, because we were in jail.
Yeah.
We were in jail in Winona when he was killed.
When he was killed in 63.
They turned off the radio. I knew that something had happened to someone I just didn't know whom. And we found out. The involvement of the National Council of Churches was very important to us, because from the relationship established in Hattiesburg, that led to the creation of the Delta Ministry, which was headed by one of the heroes of the civil rights movement named Owen Brooks. And a man who I know personally to have really done a lot of work for Mount Bio, a lot of work to help build and sustain the Freedom Democratic Party. And while he is personally not a Christian, he did the Lord's work in the Delta Ministry.
I refuse to be defined by you, Mr. Guyot. But nevertheless, I have some specific questions to ask you. First about the origins of COFO.
COFO was,
Give us your
I'll be glad to.
knowledge of that.
COFO was originally established to meet with the Governor Barnett after the 1954 Supreme Court decision. This is documented in Local People by John Dittmer, where he talks about trying to get the black leadership to come to an agreement that there would not be immediate implementation of this act.
And what did those acronyms stand for? COFO?
The Council of Federated Organizations.
Yeah. Okay.
All of
Who comprised?
that. At that time, it was comprised of the black leadership throughout the state. Later on, when it was resurrected in 1962 by Dave Dennis and Bob Moses, it then represented the Council of Federated Organizations, involved CORE, the Council of Racial Equality, SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the NACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, and the theory was that people would be more satisfied with the groups working together. Now, there have been other accounts of this, of its origin and of its revitalization, but I'm talking about the history because I know I was there. I didn't know about the earlier origin, but I certainly accept John Dittmer's position of why it was organized to deal. And in that meeting, Barnett called on a minister who he knew was Tom, and he said, now, certainly we can get you to agree that we should. And even he said, oh, no, God. That's the law. We've got to do it. And Barnett left the meeting in exasperation and said, you can't even count on the Toms these days.
That must have been him. Was that him?
I won't go that far. But you can read it in John Dittmer's book. But that's and COFO lay dormant until 1962 when it was revitalized, and the head of COFO, the titular head of COFO was Aaron Henry. Because the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had so many more members participating, we ran COFO. By we, I mean the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We were committed to identifying leaders, working with them, and that led us to people like E.W. Steptoe, Amsley Moore, Hartman Turnbow, others. Because our position was, we were about working ourselves out of a job. We were not about the job of building SNCC chapters, nor were we about the job of promoting SNCC. We were about the job of identifying leadership, working with it, facilitating it, moving on, creating some other. We took the position that there was no connection between formal education and the ability to lead. And I was amazed because 30 years later, some of the leading theorists about leadership came out with the same thing. Well, they could have simply asked us. We fought for the right of illiterates to vote. And when Katzenbach talked about the constitutionality of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, he said, well, I'm absolutely convinced all of this is constitutional with the exception of one thing. I don't think the Constitution allows or would support the involvement of illiterate people in the voting process. And I think about the irony. I think about the irony. We had people who were Elks, who were Masons, who could not read or write. And anyone who knows those two organizations knows it requires a lot of memorization, a lot of fine detail. And if they could do that, and if they could run businesses, and if the state of Mississippi's policy was to spend disproportionate amount of money on education, the state was committed to preventing people blacks from reading and writing and learning to read and write. That we felt that the illiterates we won that fight. We got that worked into the 65 Voting Rights Act, and we moved ahead. I'm very proud of the fact that Victoria Gray filed a lawsuit to do away with the poll tax. Clifton Whitley filed a lawsuit to open up to utilize Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which then led to every other civil rights organization in the South doing it. Peggy Jean Conner filed a lawsuit to reapportion the state of Mississippi. Now, I happened to meet with all of them at the National Democratic Convention, and I pointed out to a reporter what the three of them had done in its impact on the state of Mississippi.
All right, now, Mr. Guyot, give us an understanding of how the concept FDP came about.
All right. There was first a realization that there was no party registration in Mississippi. You didn't in other states, when you register as a Democrat or Republican or Independent. Here, at this time, there was no registration. You registered Owen Brooks at such an address. That was point number one. Point number two was the Democratic Party, for all practical purposes, did not have to exist except once every 4 years. It had to go to the Democratic National Convention, so they had to have a meeting to select who was going to go. But otherwise, the Democratic Party simply had an agreement. You run this county, you run that county. We don't need to be having any meetings. People will come and want to be involved. That was the general practice. The party was committed to a firm policy of racial segregation. That was in the party platform. The party did everything it could to eliminate the participation or the possibility of participation by black people. So the summer project was designed with this proposition in mind, that we were being killed off one by one. The state had all of the information about us, where we lived, who we slept with, everything about us. They knew. I gave some speeches extemporaneously at that time. They're now in the Sovereignty Commission's files. I just got to get me a truck and go get my file, okay? Because they knew everything we did. So we took the position that there should be a summer project. And now Fannie Lou Hamer and myself supported Bob Moses in this. We met in Greenville. The first day, the meeting was chaired by Dave Dennis. The decision was that there wouldn't be a summer project. Bob Moses had just returned from Macomb, where one of the witnesses to the killing of Herbert Lee was killed under a truck, and he came back and he said, look, I'm throwing my reputation behind there being a summer project. Fannie Lou Hamer supported him. I supported him. The summer project was opposed by Hollis Watkins, by Curtis Hayes, by a lot of people, and it turned on a question of these were the leaders of the movement, and they didn't want to be threatened by people who came from colleges with more expertise and credibility, and so they opposed it. We stood our ground. We won the fight. We had a summer project. Now, the summer project was designed because we had learned, Mr. Brooks, that when we conducted the freedom election in 1963,
Tell us what that was.
the freedom election was conducted.
Freedom vote.
The freedom vote was conducted throughout the state of Mississippi to dramatize that black people, if given the right, if not interfered with by state law, would vote. Aaron Henry was run as governor. Ed King was run as lieutenant governor. 80,000 plus voted in the freedom election. But we also learned that with the freedom election came white volunteers. And with white volunteers came the national press, the FBI, and the absence of violence. Now, you don't have to be a genius to understand that if you can do that, if you get those kind of ramifications, then, and you cannot protect, we could not protect ourselves against a state that was committed to our destruction.
Did that actually inspire the organization,
It-
the Freedom Democratic Party?
Well, let's put it this way. The chain I'm building goes this way. The freedom election actually inspired the conducting of the summer, Freedom Summer.
Okay,
The culmination of Freedom Summer was the creation of the Freedom Democratic Party.
okay.
So the decision then was, what do we put into the summer election? The Freedom Summer. Mm-hmm. And we had a meeting immediately after the murder of President Kennedy. President Johnson, the new president, called for a moratorium on civil rights. The NACP agreed to it. The Urban League agreed to it. SNCC did not agree to it, nor did CORE. And this was the period when we were planning to go into the summer project. We took the position that we had the right to fight for the right to vote, that we had the right not to be told by the federal government when or how to fight, because we always believe that those who are oppressed should lead the fight against their oppression, should define the terms, should determine the strategies, and pay the consequences.
All right. The political parties usually have a plank. What was in the plank of the Freedom Democratic Party? What did they stand for?
The Freedom Democratic Party stood for the proposition, as stated by Ella Baker, who was one of the speakers at the founding convention of the Freedom Democratic Party,
Which was held?
which was held at the Masonic Temple in Jackson, Mississippi, attended by over 900 people, contrary to some written reports. The Freedom Democratic Party stood for the proposition that we had to get beyond race in Mississippi, that we had to change the function of political parties, that political parties had to really go to the question of providing jobs, education, medical services, and that we really had to get people to associate the fight for the right to vote with meaningful change in their day-to-day life. If the Freedom Democratic Party had succeeded in 1964 in being seated at the Democratic National Convention, we would have so altered the change in the function of Democratic parties that they would have been more concerned, Mr. Brooks, than simply winning the elections.
Yes, sir.
And then winning elections, then disbanding every 4 years. See, look, I think that...
As I remember, there was land reform here.
There's no question. That's exactly
The
right.
plank of the Freedom Democratic.
That is correct. And the only reason I left that... Well, what we had was...
the Democrats.
What we had was a group that was that really believed that the voters have the right and the power to bring about change. Because if you wanted any test of that, we have to simply look to the state of Mississippi. Mississippi was the most creative, the most indigenous, the most inclusionary political movement in the civil rights and political movement beyond any other in the history of the United States. What did we do? We created the Council of
So
Federal...
it could be said that FDP was redefining the role of a political party here in the United States.
Absolutely.
By its beginning here in Mississippi.
That was clearly the intent. Our intent was not simply to desegregate the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi.
Amen.
That was one of the objectives, but not the main objective. We were about political change. Now, I think when we look at, I want to try to web a little bit more about the Summer Project, then I'll get more to the Freedom Democratic Party. Because the Summer Project was an attempt to we couldn't bring Mississippi to the country. We could bring the country to Mississippi. And what that led to was an agreement that we would have freedom schools, that we would have teaching about federal programs, that we would have voter registration, that we would have the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that we would have a Wednesday group. The Wednesday group was headed by, was begun by Dorothy Height. The Wednesday group entailed people coming from all across the country, coming to Jackson, Mississippi on Wednesday. They would be briefed on what happened to the volunteers in Issaquah County, what happened to them. Then they would leave, they would get reports. They would go back to their hometown. They would talk to the press, they would talk to their senator, talk to their congressman, and put pressure on the Department of Justice to do what it could to bring justice, to prevent the violence, and to let the country know what was happening.
You mentioned the name, Dorothy Height.
Dorothy Height was the head of the National Council of Negro Women, was one of the creators of the Wednesday group and facilitators of it. Now, that was part of the Summer Project. Another part of it was you had a recruitment process to bring young volunteers in from across America. What their job would be to work with blacks in their communities, to build a sense that black and white people could work together, could live together, and with this intention, purpose, in the state of Mississippi, that had a rigid racist policy. Mississippi treated the Summer Project, Paul Johnson and others, as though they would be an armed invasion. They showed policemen practicing with their shotguns. They showed them practicing with the armored tank. With the mayor of Jackson had an armored tank and some gasoline cylinders exploded in it, and they had to run. The policemen had to run out of it. But it was a force. Thompson's tank. So what we had was a major political buildup around putting Mississippi on the map politically. As you know, three people who were involved in this were Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. Now, it needs to be said that Michael Schwerner had been in Mississippi long before the Summer Project. He was working in Meridian. The Klan knew him. He was a member of CORE. He'd invited me down there to visit him in the library they were building in Meridian. So he was not simply a volunteer that came to Ohio, which incidentally was financed by the National Council of Churches. So we see a lot of benefits flowing from our relationship that was established with the National Council of Churches in the major demonstrations in Hattiesburg, the first Freedom Day in which there were no arrests in Mississippi that I call in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is thoroughly documented in Pillar of Fire, a book written by Taylor Branch. But now, so the National Council of Churches not only funded and supported the training for the volunteers coming to the Freedom Summer Project, they also, when we had the congressional challenge in 1965, challenging the congressional delegation from the state of Mississippi under Section 2 of the 14th Amendment because we were denied the right to vote, the National Council of Churches used its influence to make sure that every congressman, opened their doors to us. James Farmer, the former director of CORE, and Lawrence Guyot got to speak to a guy named the president, who later became a president, because his bishop called him and said, "We want you to talk to these people about this." And my concern is that people need to understand that the Mississippi movement was not only the most creative, but it was able to reach out to people to have impact on other institutions that would benefit the state of Mississippi.
Take us to Atlantic City with the Freedom Democratic Party.
All right. The Freedom Democratic Party is organized. I'm elected chairman of it. I'm in jail in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. I don't go to Atlantic City. What we now know about Atlantic City is that the Lyndon Johnson tapes that are available now to the public best explain.
How did FDP decide to go through the whole process of sending a delegation to Atlantic City?
The FDP understood that the only power in the state of Mississippi was the Democratic Party. There was no Republican Party of note anywhere in the South in 1964.
Yes.
Let's be very clear on that.
True.
The FDP took a position that it was the Democratic Party that was stopping hospitals from being built, that was stopping jobs, that was stopping industry from coming in here, that was supporting an educational system that was not educating blacks or whites. That if you're going to bring about change, you have to bring about change in the body politic by which the promulgation and inculcation of the evil policy is done. So we have to target the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi because of its racist policies. The Democratic Party had a firm policy of apartheid. The Democratic Party was committed to the support of Mr. Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee for president in 1964. So we took the position that we were loyal to the platforms and principles of the National Democratic Party, and we were about fundamental change. And the way to get, and we had a clear fight. We thought that there was no question about when you compared our loyalty to the loyalty of people who said we are against it, and you have to agree to a policy of segregation to vote in our primary. Not only that, but blacks were prevented from participating in that primary. So the civil rights movement then decided that what we're going to do is we're going to circulate freedom election forms. We're going to attempt to go to the precinct, the county, and the regional meetings of the regular Democratic Party, and if we're not successful with that, then we're going to conduct our own. We then held a convention to implement that. I was elected the chairman of the Freedom Democratic Party. Fannie Lou Hamer was elected the vice chairman, and I would have never been elected chairman if I didn't have the support of Fannie Lou Hamer, Annie Devine, Victoria Gray, Peggy Jean Connor, and Unita Blackwell. And the reason I had their support is I'd worked with them. Now, I beat out Leslie McLemore. I beat out Aaron Henry. Aaron Henry became chairman of the delegation. But Lawrence Guyot, thanks to those great women, was elected chairman of the Democratic Party. So our position was we had every right to fight for seating at the National Democratic Convention in 1964. We then set into motion everything that was necessary to do that. And
beginning at the precinct meetings.
Where we could attend theirs, we did. But we wasn't going to be shot attending meetings. where it was not possible, we then conducted our own. We registered 90-some thousand people with the Freedom Election Form. Bob Moses took the position that a lot of other work had to be stopped, and we concentrated on the Freedom Election Forms because we had to make a demonstration that we were serious about this, that we were committed to winning. He and others recruited Joseph Rao to represent us. Eleanor Holmes Norton was one of our representatives, and we made that fight. Joe Rao was of significance because he represented UAW, and he was a member of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. Now, what we found...
And Americans for Democratic Action.
There you go.
ADA.
There you go. Now, what we found was that when we gathered together our delegation of beauticians, laborers, teachers, civil rights workers, we were able to take on Lyndon Johnson, root and branch, until he got information of who our supporters was. And the way he got that was Bob Moses and Cortland Cox. Cortland Cox had a list of the 13 people who were supporting our right to have a floor vote. Now, Lyndon Johnson understood, and he said, I'm quoting Lyndon Johnson, "We cannot ask black people from other states who are delegates to the Democratic National Convention to vote to seat a lily white delegation from Mississippi and then go to them in November and say, vote for me for president." That's what Lyndon Johnson said. So Lyndon Johnson's strategy was stop a floor fight at all cost. Cortland Cox gave this to Congressman Diggs. Congressman Diggs gave it to the White House. The list of 13 became a list of 8. Because what the White House then did, it called the delegate in California. Said, now look, your husband can be a federal judge. All you got to do is vote against the Freedom Democratic Party. They called the delegate in New York to say, fine, we understand you're making a lot of money with OEO. You can continue to make those contracts, providing you don't vote with the Freedom Democratic Party. Now, the delegate from California was crying when she came into the room. But she had called her husband and said, I'm voting with the Freedom Democratic Party regardless of what it cost us. And she did. So, but Lyndon was able to stop us, but it took Lyndon to stop us. So my point, the point I want to make is this can be historically proven simply by going to Lyndon's tapes. Lyndon spent a lot of time on stopping us. Go read Political Participation, where they document the FBI sent 27 FBI agents to Atlantic City. They had 2 jobs. Watch Martin Luther King. One of those FBI agents rode to Atlantic City in the car with Robert Kennedy. Watch Robert Kennedy and destabilize the Freedom Democratic Party. Now, so what we had was a threat. Martin Luther King in this time had tried to meet with Lyndon Johnson at the White House about supporting the seat in the Freedom Democratic Party. This is documented on tapes released from the Johnson Library, where Johnson then said, I can't deal with him on that. So he invited all of the other civil rights leaders rather than simply Martin Luther King. And he had talked to them that we're not going to do this. So what I'm saying, Mr. Brooks, is that the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party put Lyndon Johnson in a position where he had to either join us or fight us. He chose to fight us. But it took all of his power to stop us. Because had we gotten a floor vote, which Lyndon Johnson did not want, it would have been inconceivable given the impact of Fannie Lou Hamer's speech. Fannie Lou Hamer gave one of the most effective speeches ever given at any Democratic convention. And Lyndon Johnson understood it immediately because he called a press conference to cut her off. But God is good.
Yeah, good.
Because there were 3, at that time, there were 3 agencies, ABC, NBC, and CBS. All of them played her speech in its entirety, prime time that evening. And the convention was flooded with conventions, with telegrams, seek the Freedom Democratic Party. So the move now was Lyndon had to contain a fight that had gotten beyond him because it had gotten to the people. He knew now that at all costs he couldn't afford a floor fight because a lot of people in the country now understood the issues. Here was this lady fighting simply to be treated, as she said, like other people throughout the country, given what they take for granted, the right to vote, the right to be a Democrat. Now, if you put that on a floor vote and it's televised, I don't think there'd have been 5 delegates who could have voted against the Freedom Democratic Party and go home.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Fannie Lou Hamer made that possible. Fannie Lou Hamer forced Lyndon Johnson into action. Now, when he came into action, he brought the FBI with him. He brought the entire White House. There were daily reports going to his top advisors and to him. This is the period when he threatened not to run. until he'd stabilized the Freedom Democratic Party. This is the period when Walter Reuther says to Martin Luther King, well, last year we gave you $65,000. If you keep supporting the Freedom Democratic Party, we'll not ever give you another penny. So what we found was that the freest and most powerful people in Atlantic City was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We owed nothing to no one except the people we represented. Now, other delegates who went to the Democratic National Convention in 1964 didn't come with our right to vote bathed in the blood of people we knew. The right to vote for the delegates of the Freedom Democratic Party teetered on the question of death. They'd all have to look death in the face and face it. They all understood that the right to vote in Mississippi and death was part of an equation. So when you said to them, compromise, it was quite different if you'd have said to a group of blacks from any other state. So, to its credit, the Freedom Democratic Party did not accept the compromise. And I think...
Describe what was in the compromise.
The compromise was very simple. The compromise said, we will see as honorary guests Aaron Henry and Ed King by name. Because before this had happened, Fannie Lou Hamer had sat down with Hubert Humphrey, and she said to Mr. Humphrey, she said, now, Mr. Humphrey, do you mean to tell me that your being vice president is more important than bettering the lives of 600,000 people in Mississippi? Because if that is true, I'm going to pray for you, Mr. Humphrey. I've listened to you, and I thought that you were one of us. But I'm going to seriously pray. She said, Mr. Humphrey, if you take this job as vice president on this, it will benefit you now. But if you side with us, you'll be doing the right thing. Humphrey started crying. I'm actually crying and talking about how liberal he'd done. But he swore, he said, well, I will never meet with Fannie Lou Hamer again. And he never did.
Guess not.
See, and Fannie Lou Hamer was politically not to be part of the group selected. But the good thing about that is the delegation listened to every civil rights leader you can name. They came, Martin Luther King, when speaking to the delegation before they made the decision, said, look, as a national civil rights leader, I have to encourage you to accept the compromise. But if I were a member of this delegation, I would not vote for the compromise. Roy Wilkinson, you won. Y'all don't understand this game of politics. Y'all ought to declare victory, accept the compromise, and go home. Dawkins said, of course, y'all have won. Way beyond the expectancy. The president is being very kind to y'all. Accept it and go home. You name them. The people who had been with us before caved. Jim Foreman didn't cave. Bob Moses didn't cave. And those were a couple of the exceptions. All of the civil rights leaders, Bayard Rustin came in and said, accept it. It's the right thing to do. We've won. Declare victory. Boom. You see, I'm in jail in Hattiesburg while the convention, but after the convention, Joe Rao and Lowenstein come into Mississippi, go on local radio and television stations and say the Freedom Democratic Party is fine. It did a great job in Atlantic City. All it needs is different leadership. So the fight against the Freedom Democratic Party, because it did make an ethical and courageous fight, didn't begin with the creation of the Loyalists. It began with the creation of an immediate attack by us. Bayard Rustin attacked us in commentary. He said, you know, the Freedom Democratic Party really won in Atlantic City, but they didn't understand that. We've got to move from protest to politics. And we've got to form a coalition with labor, and we've got to have some recognized goals. We've got to do that. But what we what I'm proudest of about the decision by the Freedom Democratic Party is that it was made by the delegation. There's been commentary, there've been historians who've tried to say, well, SNCC made this decision, or this group made this decision. No, it was the delegation itself. And no other group had the right, no other group had the responsibility. That delegation. Now, remember, I'm the chairman of the Freedom Democratic Party, but I'm in jail in Hattiesburg. But the delegation made me proud, and I think made the state of Mississippi proud. And it sent a message that black people could enter into political activity on their own terms, fight even Lyndon Johnson until he got the information advantage on us. Because understand, we knew we had to have a floor fight, and he knew he couldn't afford to live through one. He prevented it, but it took all of his muscle to do that. So how can you then say, well, the Freedom Democratic Party was really powerless? You don't bring the most powerful elected official in the world into combat with you and fight him toe-to-toe and be powerless. You can't do both.
His underlying reason for having it, or feeling it was necessary to defeat the Freedom Democratic Party delegation. What was that?
He said it. He said, if I seat them, I'm going to lose the South.
But he lost it.
Wait now. He said that if I seat them, we're going to, Goldwater will be president of the United States. Now, Goldwater was a far-right candidate, Republican, and we have to understand one thing very significant, because Taylor Branch does the best job of this. In Pillar of Fire, he lays out how before '64 there was no Southern, no Republican Party in the South. But in '64, the Republican Party, meeting in San Francisco, kicked out black delegates, nominated Goldwater. They kicked out black delegates from the California delegation, okay? Seated with whites. They committed themselves to a policy of racism. While the Democratic Party had passed the '64 Public Accommodations Act with the support of Everett Dirksen, quite a few Republicans had joined in passing that legislation. But the National Republican Convention...
Everett Dirksen was a Republican congressman from Illinois.
Exactly, but he was instrumental in the passage of the 1964 Public Accommodations Act.
Okay.
And my point is, the Democratic Party had committed itself on the side of the black civil rights movement. The Republican Party had committed itself antithetical and on the absolute opposite side. It was then that the Republicans began to organize in the South. Because we must state again, in 1964, there was no Republican Party in any Southern state. So now we have a move into the passage of the '65 Voting Rights Act. Well, we now know that the congressional challenge brought by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the principals were Fannie Lou Hamer, Annie Devine, Victoria Gray.
What were they seeking?
They were seeking to unseat the congressional delegation from the state of Mississippi based on Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, which says that if you deprive people the right to vote, your right to be represented in the Congress of the United States shall be deprived in ratio and proportion to the number of people you've denied. Now, it was clear. The policy in the state of Mississippi prevented blacks from registering to vote, prevented them from running for office. At the time that we filed the congressional challenge, the Department of Justice filed a case called United States versus Mississippi, which they argued that, in that case, they argued that all of the laws dealing with voting in Mississippi were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court heard that case while the challenge was still pending. And Archibald Cox refused to push for an immediate ruling by the Supreme Court, because imagine, if you will, Mr. Brooks, while we're challenging the congressional delegation,
And Archibald Cox was.
the Solicitor General of the who represented the Department of Justice in the United States before the Supreme Court. Imagine, if you will, while we're challenging the congressional delegation, if all the laws regarding their elections had been declared unconstitutional, at least that would have called for special elections, wouldn't it? But the government decided not to proceed with that, so we go through the congressional challenge. And what we find is that because of the congressional challenge, Section 5 was inserted into the Voting Rights Act. Congressman McCullum, a moderate Republican from Ohio, said when we were debating the congressional challenge before the Congress, look, we have a choice. We can either unseat the Mississippi delegation, and we had the votes, we had enough votes to maintain that. We had a congressman named William Fitz-Orion brought the challenge on our behalf. 126 congressmen stood up with support of him, which shocked everybody, because then that gave us the right to conduct depositions. We had Peggy Jean Connor's father interviewed J.P. Coleman, a former governor of the state, now a member of the state Supreme Court, of the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. We were able to provide, by we I mean the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, were able to conduct hearings throughout the state by the people we chose. We gave them federal subpoenas. They had to come. We recruited Arthur Kanoy, and Martin Stavis wrote the brief for the congressional challenge. It led to because of the existence of the congressional challenge, Congressman McCullum said, we have a choice. We can either strengthen the Voting Rights Act or unseat the congressional delegation. The move was to strengthen the voting, and that's how Section 5 was put in. So historically, the role of Mississippi in politics, in litigation, in legislation is unparalleled when we compare it to all other states in America. We helped define the fight. We helped Lawrence Guyot versus Trotter right here in Jackson, Mississippi. I had to sue for the right to pass out leaflets. I won. And here in Jackson, Mississippi, the Democratic Party threatened to send us to jail if we used the word Democratic. We stuck out Freedom Democratic Party, right?
Yeah, I remember.
Other people started trying to find other names. I stuck with that. People stuck with me. And then when the 65 Voting Rights Act was passed, they withdrew that. The Freedom Democratic Party was faced here in Jackson, Mississippi, with the state legislature passing the county consolidation bill, which said very clearly that if it's possible to consolidate any two adjoining counties to make sure that a black majority is not created, that the state of Mississippi will proceed to do that. We went into federal district court and said, you cannot do that without violating the Voting Rights Act. They did not do that, Mr. Brooks.
I remember.
If we look at the history of the Freedom Democratic Party, it was about fighting to preserve as many options for the voter and for the empowerment of black people and white people of goodwill to the fullest extent possible.
So what did they turn around and do, Mr. Guyot? They redrew the congressional act?
They redrew them, but Peggy Jean Connor went into court, and it took her quite some time to redistrict the state of Mississippi. But that suit was successful, changing the body politic. Mm-hmm. And as you now know, 1962, Bob Moses went to and some members of some students went and sat in the auditorium at the state capitol, at the state legislature. They were told, y'all have 10 minutes or y'all gonna be arrested. Now today...
Now, wait, before you leave the point, well, you've left it, but let's go back 1 second to the redrawing of the congressional district lines. That's significant. the congressional districts were divided north to south.
Uh-huh.
And when the legislature redrew them, they drew the lines east to west, so as to water down the voting. Explain that for the folks. Water down the voting power of the black majorities in the western part of the state, and dilute them with the addition of the almost all-white counties on the east.
That's true. You've explained it. 'Cause I mean, that is what happened.
That's what happened.
Now, we believe that the Connor decision was important because it changed that. You see, my concern is this. People say, well, why? I've had some experts on redistricting say, well, why did y'all use Peggy Jean Connor? I said, what we wanted to do was break up the confederation of political interests that ran the state, and we figured that reapportionment was the way to do that. You had Walter Sillars from Rosedale,
all the time.
Speaker of the House, okay? And what we were able to do was dismantle that order of hierarchy in the state legislature. So I support the decision of that came down some 17 years after it was filed, despite the earlier redistricting that had the impact that you're talking about. Now, what we have, the point I wanted to make was that in 1962, Bob Moses and others were told you got 10 minutes to get out of the state legislature. Today, 11:04:04, no one would dare use the word nigger or dare treat anyone in the state legislature like that and expect to be elected in Mississippi. Because of the growing influence of the black voters. And only because of that. I've been told by reasonable people who I will not name that the committee positions held by blacks in the state legislature make it very hard to get anything past them.
All right, let's go back for a minute to the post-1964 Atlantic City escapade, and what happened to transform the political parties, or were they transformed from that point on in some form or fashion by 1968? So.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Mr. Brooks, you're a fascinating
No, that's all
guy.
right.
I like the questions. Okay, what 1964 led to was the creation of an Equal Rights Committee, which had two roles. One, to assure that never again would a segregated delegation ever be seated. Number two, it was committed to assuring that 50% of every delegation would be female. So, as Julian Barnes said early, that when any delegation goes to any Democratic National Convention, it does so at the behest of what was done by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. We saw an opening of the delegate selection process, where which impacted not only Mississippi, but impacted the entire country, because before 1964, the party chieftains got together and decided who was going to be elected to the Democratic, who the delegates were going to be. And yes, they would have a pro forma meeting to do it, but it was pretty much determined. That had to change. The selection process, they held hearings, and that led to an official call going out to 1968, which mentioned specifically that you had to have a racial and ethnic breakdown in the total composition of all of the delegates. Now, what we saw was that in 1968, what we saw in Mississippi was that in 1968, everybody in Mississippi was united around the election of Robert Kennedy as President of the United States. Once he was out of the picture, then there were people who supported Humphrey, there were people who supported Eugene McCarthy, and there were people who supported others, okay? So we saw that in Mississippi. Now, the ability to have a fight within the Democratic Party was the White House supported Aaron Henry, Doug Wynn, and others in the creation of the Loyalist right after Atlantic City. Peggy Jean Connor was mistakenly invited to that, and she brought us all of the information. The Loyalist was created to simply destroy the Freedom Democratic Party, create another more moderate, reasonable alternative to be the liaison to the Democratic Party nationally, other than the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which had fought for but not established that right. Now, what the historians have to live with is that in 1968, at the regular Democratic convention, Bidwell Adams, who was the chairman of the regular Democratic Party, said to them, you have a choice. Either you desegregate this delegation or you're wasting your bus fare to Chicago. That was Bidwell Adams, the chairman of the regular Democratic Party, conducting the Democratic convention of the regular party of the Democratic Party here in Jackson, Mississippi. The Loyalists attended that meeting and attempted to persuade the regulars to involve black people as delegates. They then combined with the Freedom Democratic Party and the Loyalists, and I had to use all of my power and influence to persuade some of the people who I love and trust in the Democratic Party, in the Freedom Democratic Party, in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that we should be in that coalition. Because I thought we had established the precedent, we should be on the winning team. Harry Bowie, a very good friend of mine, helped me work throughout the state. Harry Bowie was a gifted member of the of the Delta Foundation. He's one of the few black Episcopalian ministers in America, and he and I worked very well on setting up the nominating commissions for the convention. For the delegate selection to the '68 Democratic Convention, which meant that 50% of the delegation came from the Freedom Democratic Party and 50% came from the Evers Group. When Harry Bowie, myself, Charles Evers, and Harding Carter met, they were astounded that we had 50% of the delegation. They said, how did y'all do it? Well, you see, again, it goes to associations. We had been working with all of the people throughout the state in politics long before there was a COFO, long before there was a delegate selection, and we were able to pull on those relationships. Now, that is a fact. Now, I noticed today, I got another.
I was there.
I know you were there.
Yeah.
But Brother Brooks, I'm talking for the camera.
I hear you.
And I'm saying that I just read today.
Yes.
I received a notice.
We had to beg some people to join that delegation.
I understand, and I understand, and see, my thing was, we had a meeting in Indianola.
They had one in Green.
Aaron Henry was there.
You remember the one in Green?
Absolutely.
You sure you remember?
I'm sure, but I'm sure you're gonna help me.
No, that's all right.
But my point is this: we had to make. But the reason we could pull off that decision,
yes,
was because people trusted us.
yes.
The people, the Fannie Lou Hamers, the Annie Devines, the Victoria Grays, they said, look, we stand behind this. And I could then go into Indianola and say to all members of the Freedom Democratic Party, this is where we're going, this is how we should go, but I could not do it unless they agreed to it. And they came to agreement on it. See? But I like the fact that we were able to fight on our own terms.
Well, we had to.
In the state and in the country. And we did not always prevail, but we never caved in. We always stuck to the issue. We were always about empowerment, and we were always about inclusion, and we were always about change. We never fought to maintain the status quo on anything.
No, I'm just thinking about the leadership of the delegation in '68 and how it came to be.
That's right.
You remember?
Yeah,
Describe that.
well, it came to be that they got 50%, we got 50%. And there was clearly a lot of attention paid to the fact that, you have Aaron Henry, you have Harding Carter, you have Charles Evans, you have Lawrence Guyot, and a lot of attention was paid to that because we had always, as you know, Mr. Brooks, we had not always been together on issues.
Well, wasn't it already a foregone conclusion that the delegation was going to be seated?
No, it was not. No, it was not. Here's what we had.
That's a difference of opinion.
Here's what we had.
Yes.
Here's what we had. A lot of people, the press, thought that the Freedom Democratic Party was going to be seated. And even after the coalition of the Freedom Democratic Party and the lawyers was seated, the New York Times came out the next day and said the Freedom Democratic Party was seated. So the major press lost the maneuver on that. Now, in '68, what you had was Julian Bond challenging
No, that isn't what I said.
okay,
It was a foregone conclusion that the interracial delegation coming from Mississippi in 1968 was going to be seated. That commitment was made
okay.
in '64
All right,
in
all right.
Atlantic City.
okay. Now, we can agree on that.
Yes.
But there was no agreement on what would be the composition of that delegation.
No.
Yes.
And it was agreed, it was thought by all of us
Uh-huh.
that whatever the delegation was that wound up in Chicago, it would be thought to be a Freedom Democratic Party
That's right.
delegation.
That's right.
By the people nationally. We could not convince them otherwise.
And I think it was very clear that idea was validated more and more and more.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Sure enough, that's all I was saying.
Uh-huh.
Okay? And what did this result in as far as dividends for the people of Mississippi, or did it result in dividends?
Well, I think one of the pure dividends of that kind of political activity is Benny Thompson. Benny Thompson was elected to the Congress. He's done an admirable job. He has introduced a resolution commemorating the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He has been instrumental in providing training to a lot of the political activists and a lot of the politicians. He brings them to Tougaloo College. He brings in experts, and he provides them accurate day-to-day information on how they can empower themselves and their constituents. I think the change in the body politic of the Democratic Party is something that is yet a-borning. The Democratic Party, as we know it today, is too committed to winning elections to really deal with the question of party function and party change and the kind of alignment that the Freedom Democratic Party was designed for. You were in the audience yesterday at the museum when one lady said, well, now I understand. I didn't know about the Freedom Democratic Party, but now that I know about it, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was different from the Democratic Party as we know it now. And you and I would readily agree that's true. The Democratic Party has yet to really come to the realization that until it is committed to fight in its history on the terms of its constituents and not cave in to the adversaries about, as long as the opposition can define what's acceptable to fight about, those who do the defining will win the battle. We need to have a Democratic Party that is, I think there's a logical connection between MFDP, Jesse Jackson, and Howard Dean.
Now, Mr. Guyot,
Uh-huh.
for the sake of posterity here,
Uh-huh.
the rise of the Republican Party in the state of Mississippi, which we forecast,
Mm-hmm.
describe how that came about.
It was purely about race. It was about a early support of Ronald Reagan by the present governor.
Don't leave out George Wallace.
George Wallace came to Mississippi had a tremendous impact, not only in Mississippi, but in Maryland, Wisconsin. George Wallace was a moving political phenomenon, and his policy was race, 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 and race. The Republican Party,
Would you have called him an opportunist?
or I would have called him
Or
a
was he
racist,
dyed in the wool?
an opportunist, and a formidable political adversary. George Wallace made people come to the realization that there was political capital in racism. George Wallace personified racism in the ultimate. And George Wallace was able to sell George Wallace throughout the country. And I think the assassination of George Wallace proves how effective others thought he would be.
Now, the rise of the Dixiecrats in 1948, which you read about, what made George Wallace more successful than those Dixiecrats were in 1948?
Because he timed his move as a backlash to all of the advances of the civil rights movement, to all of the legislation, to all of the public debate. Remember, before 1964, a person could travel from Mississippi to Washington and not be able to use one public restroom, not be able to register in a hotel, not be able to eat in a restaurant. So George Wallace was capitalizing on the backlash of how dare they force us to treat them like we're one of us. And his campaign was about racism, about a backlash. It was anti-federal government, and it was anti-change. He wanted us to, he talked about the pointed head liberals in the federal government. See, the interesting anti-federalism of George Wallace is now reflected in the anti-federalism of George Bush. Bush, as the president of the United States, can't dismantle the federal government, but he is anti-federalism, he's anti-affirmative action, and he's the centralization of governmental powers. That's why he says, look, I can't destroy the federal government, but I can break it, I can spend its money. People talk about, so his plan is to have as strong, as weak a central government as possible, go back to states' rights as much as possible. And those are fights that we will be left to fight, and I think we have to prevail, because if we don't prevail, America as we know it will not prevail.
Mr. Guyot.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you. The fruits of the civil rights movement of the 60s.
Future civil rights movements of the 60s.
Let me frame the question.
All right.
What would you consider to be, all right, maybe the 4 or 5 most important, advances that were made?
All right.
Okay,
One,
as a result of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, 70s, etc.
Okay. One, that people can bring about change. That the federal government to be forced to deal with political issues. Public accommodations, Voting Rights Act. You look at all of the legislation passed by Lyndon Johnson. Look at aid to dependent children. Look at Medicare, Medicaid. That happened with Lyndon Johnson. Look at the whole concept of more money for higher education. Look at the Hills-Brayton Act. When we look at politics before Lyndon Johnson and after Lyndon Johnson, we can say that the civil rights movement was a success. When we look at the realization that ordinary people can do extraordinary things politically, that flows out of, that to me, that's one of the most important benefits of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement should not be defined simply by the legislation that it passed, but by the lessons that it taught. That people, ordinary people, can make political change a reality. But it is only when people fight to bring about change does it occur. I cannot think of one piece of major legislation that happened without a fight. And I don't think any exist. I don't think any will exist. And I don't think any should exist. Governmental policy is the business of the people. The civil rights movement broke down the myth that only wealthy people, or only very intelligent people, and not too many of them, should be making political decisions. The civil rights movement sent the message that everyone has a right, a responsibility, and they must either have or create an opportunity to be heard. That if you're old, the civil rights movement sent the message that if you're old enough to be oppressed, you're old enough and well-trained enough to fight oppression. The civil rights movement sent the message that leadership is not born. It is created, it is accepted, it has to be indigenous, it has to be inclusionary, it has to be about change, and it has to be prepared to take risk. The civil rights movement's lesson was that leadership is much more important than leaders. That anyone who can think has the power to lead. That there is no connection between the ability to lead and formal education. So I think the benefit of the civil rights movement was to move us progressively and conceptually ahead where we can arrive at a point where we can say that there's nothing that is not political. And those who do not wish to be politically involved should send all of their money to me. Because if you're going to really accept a form of removal of power from yourself, why not do it completely? There's been some excellent books written about the civil rights movement and about Mississippi. Some of that didn't end by by Len Holt, excellent book. Pillar of Fire by Taylor Branch. Local People by John Dittmer. The whole question of the 1968 Civil Rights Commission entitled Political Participation. Frank Parker's book, Why Black Votes Count. You see, the history of Mississippi and the literature written about Mississippi is a curriculum all in and of itself.
Let me ask you a pointed question.
Sure.
Have we lost any of the advances that we made?
I think the good thing about
as a result of the movement?
The good thing about these kind of issues that I talked about as advances is if you don't use them, you lose them. And that was another lesson taught by the civil rights movement. The lesson taught by the civil rights movement was that if you have them and don't use them, you lose them. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I understand what you're right.
And I'm saying that there is now more of a reason, there are now millions of reasons for us to take the proposition that we have to get more involved in civic engagement from the womb to the tomb. We have to, because the forces moving in this country right now are fundamentally committed to not representing us. The forces ruled in this country are more interested in incarcerating young black people than educating them. And we've got to be able to say that we're prepared to make the fight. And I think, I'm often reminded that when we die, we're going to have to face our ancestors who were slaves. And I'm told that they're going to ask us two questions. What did you do with your freedom? And what did you do to free other people? And I think we'd better be prepared to answer those questions. Because if we look right now at our semi-oppression, we are not as oppressed as they were, and they fought. So what's our excuse?
Well, that's one way to say we're freer to fight than we ever were.
We are freer to fight. We have more to fight about. We have more reasons to fight. And we also have to understand the Republican Party will take everything it can see. The Republican Party feels that there are too many people registered to vote. There are too many people applying for jobs. There are too many people not like them applying for medical services. There are too many people depending on the federal government. So let's weaken the federal government. Let's turn to more activities
Let
back.
me ask you another question. It's often said, I've said it very often. All my years in the movement, I became very aware of the fact that we were not all in it for the same reason. And the values, there wasn't one set of values that really defined that struggle during that period of time.
Charles Evans said it to me best.
Would you like to expound on that a little bit?
I'll be glad to, and I've used Brother Charles Evans as plaque example. I was his campaign manager when he ran for Congress.
How did you?
And he said to me, he said, Mr. Guyot, said, you and I are different people. He said, I believe that I should make as much money in the civil rights movement as possible, and money doesn't matter to you. He said, now when I ran a whorehouse in Chicago, I got paid before any of the customers were served. I said, Charles, what does that have to do with this? He said, unless you can make money out of something, you shouldn't waste any time doing it. Now, Mr. Evans, as you know, was a prominent civil rights leader, but his fundamental motivating drive was to make money. He made a lot of it. I remember when he got in tax trouble, I was in the courthouse when it was announced that Senator Eastland was one of his chief supporters to make sure that his tax problem was taken care of. So, yes, there was no universality in why people got in the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
But the beautiful thing about it, Brother Brooks,
Yes,
was
sir.
that the civil rights movement provided an entree for those of goodwill who were ethically committed to empowering others, who really believed about creating institutions run by the people for the people and in the interest of the people and on behalf of the interest of the people. It provided an opportunity for them to do that. And it provided an opportunity despite the coin seekers, despite the people who got in it simply for money. And there were quite a few of them. But despite them, it also sent a lesson that leadership could be created, that leadership must be created, it must be replenished, and it must be extended, and that every 10 years, new leaders must be produced. Because the values and the history and the information changes, but the fight around the question of empowerment and indigenous formulation of policy never changes, and it never will.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, help yourself.
In light of technology today and the vast media coverage that is apparent, do you think the fight will be more difficult because of that? Because, I mean, during the civil rights movement, of course, I was not privy to that. It's just through history.
I understand.
Media was not as vast as it is now. If something was put out there, it had a time to travel and get to where it needs to be. But now things can be cut off so very quickly. I mean, you can say something one moment and in seconds it can be done away with. It won't even reach. I mean, it appears it should reach a vast number of people because technology is so vast now. But they have the ability to just sort of cut things off. I mean, and that was evident with a lot of things that were happening before the election, that they would hold information for a very long time and put information out, in a time of question when they were ready, and then even snip it. So, I mean, do you think that this new technology and the vastness of it can prohibit, a fight,
Absolutely not. You see, that cuts both ways. The technology can be used to bring about change, and it can't be stopped. I mean, we now have direct access communication techniques that's open to a lot of people. And so I don't think anyone can stop a movement that is issue-oriented, that is indigenous, and that the people behind it really see it in their interest. I think I'm comfortable in saying that's impossible. Because the same technology, see, you got to remember, there weren't any cell phones in the civil rights movement.
Right.
There weren't any emails in the civil rights movement. There was sometime, I remember cranking them old fax machines. You turned it with your hand. You know. So let's understand, the ability of people to communicate is something that we are losing. And the ability, right now there's a book called Bowling Alone. Mm-hmm. You know, we don't play cards as often, we don't visit people as often, we don't, you know, it is possible it would be possible for the four of us to work in this building and never see each other because of the technology. So we can't blame the technology for our moving away from the simple fact that our greatest asset has always been us. Let me say that again. In Bulgaria, I'm gonna use this example. In Bulgaria, people were so frightened about the state government that they would only organize 3 people, and they organized for a year like that. And the revolution was to begin the day that a particular song was played. This is documented on the front page of the Washington Post. And someone accidentally played that song, and the revolution went ahead successfully. My point being this: if we could organize in Mississippi beginning from 1961 to 68, there's nowhere on earth that anyone should be able to say, we cannot organize. In 1961, when you registered to vote, your name and address was posted in the newspaper. In 1961, there was a sovereignty commission. There was a White Citizens Council. They were dedicated to the proposition to stamp anybody out who defied them. And any black who registered to vote defied them. That was not stopped. A lot of people were killed. But you imagine, if you will,
Mr. Guyot.
if you can get, hold on, let me finish this. If you can get thousands of people to risk everything that they have on the right to vote, on the empowerment of them, for themselves, and transcending themselves to their children, how can you stop a movement that really, of people who really want to move? Yes, sir.
Participatory democracy.
Participatory democracy should not be a slogan. It must be
A reality.
a reality, because, you know.
Well, that was part of our quest. Well,
It was part of our quest. It must always be part of our quest.
Right.
Democracy is not a spectator sport. Those people who are not active and who want their dreams and their aspirations and their hopes brought to them by someone else will die waiting, and should.
You didn't let me ask the question.
All right, go ahead. I thought, but go ahead, by all means. Incidentally, this is a great interview. Go ahead.
No, I'm serious about, how much we have succeeded and how much we've failed.
Let's put it this way.
In creating the atmosphere, or creating the ability, right, for people to freely now vote. And we struggled for 50% of the electorate to participate in the most popular election every 4 years, which is the presidential election. And wait a minute.
Go ahead.
There are places in this world, right, that you can describe, and so can I, where 70 or 80% of their electorate are happy to come out and participate.
Brother
And
Brooks,
we've been voting much longer.
Brother Brooks,
Yes, sir.
until we talk about the change in the function of political parties that go beyond simply winning elections, until we talk about the institutional empowerment of neighborhoods by political parties for the empowerment of the neighborhoods and not the political parties, until we talk about politics.
You mean the protection of the institution?
I'm talking about the empowerment of neighborhoods rather than the empowerment of the political parties.
Yes.
And I'm saying, until we until we can say that we are more interested in how a presidential election impacts on whether or not I have an education, whether or not I have police protection, whether or not I have medical insurance, whether or not I have a sense of feeling that this is a great country,
Amen.
and I can be a part of that, making that a great country and maintaining it as a great country, until we can say that we've arrived at the point as a country where we understand that as long as there's a connection between property values and public education, we will always have bad schools. Until we reach the point where political parties say our fight must be the fight of federal funding for public education.
Amen.
And see, so I'm simply saying, we cannot blame people for not voting unless we bring the connection to them of why their vote makes a difference and why the issues that are raised applies to them. Now,
And that's why people won't vote.
no,
Because they don't see it.
now, hold on now. There's no reason based on our history, especially your and my history. We have seen people change. We have seen more involvement. What we have yet to see is the kind of change that I was talking about, as it relates to function, as it relates to approach, and as it relates not only to political parties, but as it relates to political activists who must be about the job of empowering as many people as possible rather than about the job of controlling as many people as possible.
So it can be said, and is said by some, that people don't control political parties and the manner in which they function.
That's right.
Very simple.
Let's put it this way. Very few people, but not the people.
The people.
That's right. And see, the trade-off has got to be.
And they, in fact, do not function for the benefit of the people.
You're right. Political parties right now are consolidated around the winning of elections on certain terms for certain people under certain conditions.
And the perpetuation of their institution.
There's no
The
question.
political party.
There's no question. Now,
We're in one of
I understand that. I won't go into. Yes, that is true. But see, what we also have to understand is that there's no change that we feel is necessary. We're together on that cannot be made to happen. But we must also arrive at the conclusion with certainty that the Democratic Party or the Republican Party will never be involved in funding or supporting a change in the political alignment or in the political dialogue that will weaken them in any way.
Bottom line, is there much difference between the two parties?
Of course, there's a fundamental difference.
There you go.
There's a fundamental difference.
Yeah, you just said it.
The Republican Party.
But
No,
because you didn't
no.
describe
The Republican
Turn
Party.
off the tape.
The Republican Party is anti-federalist. It is anti-affirmative action. It is pro-states' rights. It is pro-racist. It is against a strong central government as it relates to health. It is against the federal funding of public education. The Democratic Party, warts and all, has been a leader.
What's and all?
It has been a leader. Has been a leader
Shall we
in the expansion of the power of the individual, the expansion of the power of the central government, and an expansion of services and a commitment to services and enhancement of people. To me, there's a fundamental difference between them. And I hope we'll understand that when the House and the Senate is organized, it's not organized around left-handed or right-handed. You get your power in the House or the Senate based on whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican. If the Republicans are in control, you get a lot of power. If the Democrats are in control, you get a lot of power. But there's no other demarcation. So the value of political parties goes right to the very nature of the function of how power is applied in the federal government. Now, I'm an advocate for a strong central government. I think that states are fair and good and proper things and instrumentalities, but they should not be making federal policy. The Republicans say the best way to get a federal policy is find out what the states want.
That's words. Do they really believe that? They have enlarged the central government, right? To
Well,
a
now-
magnitude that is far exceeded.
Now you see, you asking
Something that
me,
anybody could have imagined.
you asking
The
me
same,
to,
I say they speak out of both sides of their mouth.
Brother Brooks, you asking me to
No,
defend
I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to be
Mr. Bush,
understated.
to defend Mr. Bush, who came into government with a surplus, who created a deficit,
The
and
largest
he's a
known
Republican,
man.
the largest known. So, but I'm gonna leave that to him.
Yes. So I think there's some words in there. Those are some words about what they truly stand for and
Yeah.
what they in fact do.
That's right. They have run a race about the demonization of carrying, and they're for the war, and they're against same-sex marriage. Jesse Jackson did it best. Jesse Jackson was in a black church. He said, "How many of y'all plan to marry somebody of the same sex?" And nobody.
But that was a diversion.
It was a diversion that unfortunately worked.
It worked.
And see, my thing, again, you know, you get sold what you'll buy. If we don't get the constituents to raise fundamental issues around their interest in the body politic and stop thinking that politics is not relevant, stop thinking that it doesn't have power, stop thinking that politicians are inherently evil, and start thinking about how can we make this political system work for us. That's the true job of leadership today.
I thank you very much, Mr. Guyot.
I thank you, Mr. Brooks, and I'll do a
I'm
lot of
sorry that we really, at the tail end of this interview, we started to have dialogue with each other. Which
No,
is not the purpose, as
No,
you
no,
well
I-
know, of the interview.
No, let me say this. I do a lot of interviews. I have never been more proud of being interviewed by you.
Oh my.
I know your history. I'm proud of it. I'm proud to be
That
associated
off
with
the
you
tape.
politically.
That does not belong on the tape.
If that's not on the tape, I will withdraw my release. Mr. Brooks has been a major hero in
That is not part of it.
the political
You kindly
movement
shut the tape.
of Mississippi. I've watched that personally, and so I'm proud of this interview, and I expect to see that in the tape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you
I'm
very
very
much.
proud of you and
You're the toughest interview I've had so far. I have to say that.
well, I tell you one thing.
It was hard to keep you on point.
I'll say one thing to you. You came up with some good questions, some very good questions. So
Very difficult to keep you on point.
Well,
But I know you very well.
see now, brother.
Give
Brooks,
you an inch and you take
I got
200
to.
miles.
I got to.
200
A
miles.
whole inch, of course.
Yes, I know.
What I want is this. I want a copy of all of this, even if you don't put it in. Okay, put it on the document because I like what happened. I like your questions.
Well, I
Thank
don't
you
think we
very
plan
much.
to edit.